So, very good morning to all of you here in the room, and also to those who follow us on the YouTube channel of the Hungarian Economic Association. My name is Gyula Pleschinger. I am president of the Hungarian Economic Association. And on behalf of our presidency and certainly myself, I warmly welcome you at the joint conference of the Hungarian Fiscal Council and the Hungarian Economic Association. And now I kindly ask the president of the Hungarian Fiscal Council to welcome you here.
Welcome everyone. And thank you for all to come, and thank you for the organization of this traditional conference of the Hungarian Fiscal Council, the Hungarian Economic Association. We are honored by our two distinguished guests, Mr. Daniel Dăianu, Chairman of the Fiscal Council of Romania, and Mr. Mojmír Hampl, Chairman of the Czech Fiscal Council, accepting our invitation to the conference. Thank you and welcome to Budapest. The majority of the audience might know, favoring the newcomers, I share with you the purpose of the conference to share and discuss the opinions of economists participating in supporting of the Fiscal Council of Hungary on the Hungarian economy and fiscal matters. My predecessor, Mr. Árpád Kovács, launched this initiative together with the Hungarian Economic Society. And I'm happy to continue this tradition. And I say thank you to the Hungarian Economic Society and to its president, Mr. Gyula Pleschinger, for the organization and the cooperation, and for inviting honorable guests, my fellow chairman from Czechia and Romania. And I also say thank you to the National Bank of Hungary and its governor, Mr. György Matolcsy, for hosting us at this beautiful venue. Last but not least, I say thank you for the economists supporting the work of the Fiscal Council of Hungary, my colleagues at and beside the Secretariat of the Council itself, colleagues of the National Bank of Hungary, and colleagues of the State Audit Office, who all do their work according to the law, however, with the commitment stretching far beyond what any law could prescribe. And also for the economists of the best economic research labs in Hungary, who provide excellent decision preparation input to the Council. More than that, some of them this year even twice, as the majority of you know that the spring planning, which became a tradition in the last decade in Hungary, was put back to autumn, so they refreshed their materials for the Council. So I warmly welcome everybody to the conference. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Gábor. Well, Gábor made my job more easy. So you may wish to know that we have been organizing this conference, this joint conference, for more than a decade. And the purpose is, as Gábor has mentioned, to collect all the research materials and studies that top Hungarian research institutions have prepared for the Fiscal Council. At the end of the day, we collect all these studies, all these papers, and issue them in the form of an annual joint publication. This year, we decided to make an experiment to bring some international flavor into this event. So this is why we invited the presidents of the fiscal councils from Romania, from Czechia, and certainly from Hungary, just to have a panel discussion with them on how they see the new EU regulations, how they see the role of the fiscal councils in the light of the new regulations, and how they see the fiscal processes in the respective countries and in Europe. All three panelists are well-known and highly respected captains of the industry, with a long list of credentials, which I certainly don't want to run through, but I would like to mention or cherry pick some key milestones in their career. So let me start with Mr. Daniel Dăianu, who is the president of the Romanian Fiscal Council. He has been in his position from 2019. And he started his career as a research analyst and then became the chief economist at the Central Bank of Romania. He was a prime minister, not a prime minister, minister of finance. And basically, he almost became a prime minister. So he was one of the candidates back in 2009 or sometime there, but he refused to go for the position. So my mistake was not that huge. But anyway, then he was a member of the European Parliament. Then he served on the board of the biggest Romanian commercial bank, BCR. Then he was a member of the board of the central bank. And then in 2019, he became the president of the Fiscal Council. Moving on, let me introduce Mr. Mojmír Hampl. Mojmír has been in his position from 2022. He spent most of his career with the Central Bank of Czechia. He started again as a research analyst, and he became a long-standing board member. Then he spent 2 terms as a deputy governor at the central bank. And after the expiration of his second term, he joined the KPMG as director for financial institutions and financial markets. And in 2022, he was appointed the president of the Fiscal Council. And last but not least, we have Gábor Horváth, whom you know pretty well. He has a second-to-none expertise in risk management, in macroeconomic analysis, asset liability management, and wealth management. He earned his practice mainly within the OTP group, which is the biggest Hungarian banking group, but he also worked for other banks or other financial institutions like the then HVB right now, it is UniCredit Bank, and the Lombard leasing company, this is a leasing company. So I think that we have a really high flyer panel here. And I will ask them to deliver a short presentation listing the key points they would like to touch in the course of the discussion. Then we will have a discussion on the issue they are going to raise. And finally, if we will have some time before the lunch break, then certainly any question from the floor would be more than welcome. So I stop here and I ask our first panelist, Gábor, may I ask you, so to start the presentations. Thank you.
Okay, so I will be very brief and take a look at the landscape of the European Union concerning fiscal matters from a helicopter view. You may know that the pandemic had a particular consequence on the fiscal rules, the economic governance framework of the European Union. Namely, some of its rules have been suspended for a couple of years in order to leave more room of maneuver for the member states of the European Union to tackle the economic problems arisen from the pandemic. However, the pandemic was followed by an energy price crisis and then a war in the neighborhood. However, after a few years, the European Union and the member states decided to lift the suspension, and at the 30th of April this year, the new European Economic Governance Framework became valid. When the suspension came in 2020, the European Union was about to review this framework. So the new era what we entered at the 30th of April is with a renewed framework. The reinforcement of this governance framework and the fiscal rules meant that the corrective measure, which have been long part of the framework, has been introduced against 8 countries of the EU. More precisely, 7 excessive deficit procedure has been started and 1 restarted in Europe. One of the critics against the framework was already a few years ago that it's too complex, it's hard to explain. Now we have maybe an even more complex framework because alongside with the new rules introduced, quite some of the old rules remained with us, and we have to consider both of them, so the new ones and some of the old ones as well. In an era when there are multiple challenges in front of the European Union, another critic of the framework was and remained, because the first assessment of the new framework contained this element as well, that this setup will hardly incentivize the public investment in Europe, which is anyway lagging behind not just the US, but also the needs of Europe. Some of the challenges in front of Europe are the competitiveness challenges. I refer here to the Draghi report published a few weeks ago, the so-called green transition, the transition into the digital economy, or the defense spending, which has been a long ignored area, at least in the last 3 decades, thanks to a relatively peaceful period of not just the European Union, but maybe the world, at least compared to previous periods. However, it seems that this is over now. In terms of spending, the most frequently asked questions are, for what do we spend and how much do we spend? Even concerning the Draghi report, the most frequently referred proposal was that Europe needs an almost unprecedented yearly investment spending, both public and private, maybe reaching the 5% of GDP, which again, I say, almost unprecedented in the history of the continent. And the discussion begin how to finance this amount, where to spend it. Should we spend it on European level or member states level? However, the less frequently asked question is how we spend this money. And I think this is a very important question. This might make the difference between successful spending and unsuccessful spending. And how to spend it means much more than just saying what are the focus industries or where we spend this. It goes beyond just the economic framework. It contains the whole framework. When I'm referring to our competitors, the US or Asia, definitely we are living among different circumstances in terms of social standards, in terms of environmental standards. Maybe parts of the success of Asia and US come from these different standards, and we should put the question, would we like to lower these standards in order to be more competitive, or are we pursuing a different strategy in regain our competitiveness? Another challenge, and this is not a specific European challenge, but a challenge for all modern states, is in an era when the aim is to, as in European Union we often hear, to rebuild the fiscal buffers spent over the last couple of years. The challenges are not coming only from on the spending side, but also on the revenue side, to the tax system, to the traditional tax bases. For instance, aging is usually mentioned in the framework of spending side challenges. However, this is imposing challenges on the revenue side of the tax system as well. The digital economy is it's not just a possibility for competitiveness, but it's also a phenomenon and a development which might erode the traditional tax base. If trade goes to the internet, it might cause problems for the national tax authorities to pursue the tax revenues. The debate started, at least among economists. Less can be heard on the political level because the topics are sensitive. I just mentioned here one on the slide. Taking into consideration the ever-evolving concentration, not just in income, but also in wealth. Should we turn to wealth taxation? Certainly, this is a sensitive question. We can cite numerous negative experiences from the press. What can be a reaction to such proposals or considerations? But definitely, this is an issue with which all modern states should face on a medium term at the latest. Given this background in the European Union, do I say that independent fiscal institution established in order to be advocates of fiscal prudence should take into consideration these developments and make their stance more flexible in this respect? I don't think so, not at all. Segregation of duties is another very important principle to be successful, both for companies and for countries. Segregation of duties in this respect means that tackling with decisions regarding the tax system, how much we spend, where we spend, and how we spend, there are responsibles in national governments at the European level as well. The duty of these independent institutions is to safeguard fiscal prudence with assessment, opinion forming, suggestions. And this is the only thing the IFIs should have regard during their work, regardless of the challenges which should be solved, but IFIs should stick to their original mission, safeguarding fiscal prudence. Thank you.
Thank you very much for Gábor's introductory speech, and now I ask Daniel to continue.
Is it mine? Put on. Gábor, this is your stuff. Okay, how do I get to mine? I should get out. I don't understand it. Okay, it's mine. Okay, okay, good. Okay, great. I'm sorry. I'm very grateful for this invitation and thankful to the Fiscal Council of Hungary and the National Bank of Hungary. I have many friends here in Budapest, and I'm glad to be able to share some of my thoughts on general issues, but also on what I call the fiscal question in Romania. Let me just start with the international context. And I would say that fragmentation continues in the world economy. There is also what we've known for years, a shift of economic power towards Asia. And there are increasing security concerns and geopolitical tensions. I don't want to delve into all this, but there is a very severe impact on the macroeconomic situations in Europe and on public debts and budget deficits, all of which are, or most of them are rising, and not accidentally. The IMF is deeply concerned about it. There is, and Gábor has mentioned it, the EU's competitiveness gap. The Draghi report is pretty thorough and bold in what it says about the state of the union in general. And there is the Trump II effect. The new Republican administration with the looming trade warfare, more inflation, a new inflation spike, possible currency wars, and stability risks due to deregulation of finance, which in my view would be very bad. Lower economic growth, the higher defense expenditures might stimulate economy short term. Now, the fiscal budget strains in the EU, this is also, it's like a platitude, but it pays to mention it. Lower economic growth due to the shocks, the pandemic, climate change, the energy crisis, and the war in Ukraine. Policy rates in real terms have turned positive, and this has an impact on debt service. We see nominal policy rates declining significantly due to the descending inflation, but the positive real monetary policy rates do impact debt service. Budget deficits on the rise in not a few EU countries, but also in Central and Eastern Europe. And 7 new EU member states have got under the EDP procedure. Romania was in 2019, 2020, Romania was the only one member state under EDP. Defense expenditures on the rise in not a few EU member states, and there are painful trade-offs. All budgets are under strain. I don't want to get too much into it. I have already mentioned. New fiscal roles in the EU. Gábor has mentioned, I mean, it's ironically, the attempt was to simplify. However, I mean, they continues to be, some would rather say that they are more complex. But to be fair, they provide more flexibility for macro corrections. 4 years, 7 years, net expenditure is the operational tool. But, and this is what has pissed me off for years, and I did mention it in the framework of the network of IFIs. I've said it for years, that, and this is a flaw of the way we operate in the network. We do not address major design flaws of the euro area. No joint fiscal capacity, no EDIS, a European Deposit Insurance Scheme, no safe asset. So it's like the elephant in the room, and because there is so much political sensitivity on these issues, I mean, we shun away from saying anything. At the same time, these rules, in my humble opinion, underestimate the impact of climate change, of trade wars, of the war economy syndrome, because countries may have to pay more for defense, on macro imbalances. And I'm also glad that Gábor has mentioned it, because most of the time we talk about restraining expenditure, cutting expenditure, but in view of the big challenges, obtaining higher tax revenues, in my view, is inescapable. How you do it, it's a big question, how you do it. Whether you tax flows, whether you tax wealth. The IFIs are not in the business of telling governments what to do. We have debates inside. We talk among ourselves. We do not expose a single ideology. I mean, in the Romanian Fiscal Council, there are economists of different persuasions. So, and it's tricky to get into the business of telling governments what to do. The IFIs should stay in their own territory, should not be involved in policymaking. They should speak up, they should be watchdogs of fiscal prudence, advocate a prudential approach to budget construction and so on and so on. Now, the Romanian fiscal question, and I'll be very brief because I'm running out of time. We have been running pretty large budget deficits. The public debt is still manageable. The budget deficit on the rise this year, about 8% of GDP, is going to be the biggest budget deficit in the Union. It's an election year, it's true. A twin deficit syndrome. Romania is an outlier in this regard. We have both a high budget deficit and a current account deficit, which is higher than the budget deficit. Half of the budget deficit funding is on domestic market. And half of the current account deficit funding is through borrowing. And very low tax revenues as against the peer countries, about 27%, including contributions, while the average in the Union is about 40%, 35% in Hungary, in Poland, in the Czech Republic. So there is scope for raising tax revenues. And the government submitted a medium-term structural budget plan which covers 7 years. So from about 8%, very likely this year, the budget deficit should be brought to 2.5% in 7 years. But it's a very big challenge. And in the Council, we believe that there is insufficient attention put on the tax revenue side. Too much emphasis is put on the expenditure side. If Romania will be able to bring the budget deficit to below 3% over a period of, I don't know, if 7 years may be too long, markets could become very nervous. So we should not bet on patience on the part of the markets. But I think it's not a mission impossible, but it's going to be very hard. If we bring the budget deficit down to below 3%, we very likely would bring also the current account deficit below 4% of GDP. And I would emphasize the role of EU funds for economic stability. A large share of public investment is funded by EU funds. But a note of caution, in the future, EU funds will be downsized for various reasons, and the termination of the national recovery and resilience plans and a change in the structure of the EU budget. Cohesion funds probably will be diminished. And I should stop on this note. Being in the EU is a major plus to mitigate shocks, but the international environment is highly complicated, to use a euphemism, and new shocks may be in the offing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel. And last but not least, may I ask Mojmír to come with his interventions.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to all the organizers for inviting me and having me. And special thanks to my dear long-term friend, Gyula. Whenever he asks to come, I always have got a tendency to come. And I'm pleased to be with you. And I'm especially pleased to see so many people who are in the audience and wearing ties. It's not that normal these days. So that's absolutely brilliant. We have made an agreement that I will not have a formal presentation in PPT. I've got a couple of speaking points, and I hope that these will provoke some debate and questions. My points go to the issue of the rules, the fiscal rules themselves. A brief history of the EU fiscal rules. They started in 1997, relatively straightforward and easy to understand. We still keep following them up until now. These very famous two numbers, 3 and 60. And they were meant as acyclical rules, and they were meant as rules that would ensure the monetary policy dominance. You might recall it. These rules were constructed so that the monetary policy dominates and not the fiscal policy dominates. But after some time, we realized that actually these rules are pro-cyclical, very much pro-cyclical. And one perfect description of the procyclicality of the fiscal policy was the quote by the previous finance minister of Ireland. He then became a EU commissioner. You might recall the name, Charlie McCreevy. And he described perfectly what the procyclicality of fiscal policy is. He said, when I have the money, I spend it. When I don't, I don't. This is, in essence, this is the absolute essence of procyclicality of fiscal rules. And we realized in the EU that this is somewhat problematic and that we should take the economic cycle more into account. So we started with more counter-cyclical rules, and we invented the concept of the structural balance. But you, again, might recall that we started having a difficulty with the structural balance. The structural balance is a very good concept for us macroeconomists, but very hard to understand for politicians, for policymakers. I do remember Bruno Le Maire. You know him. This is one of the longest-serving finance ministers in France up until 2024. And at one of the ECOFIN meetings, he said, "Well, I've been doing this job for 6 years, and I still do not understand the structural balance and the concept of that." And I understand that because it's really not that intuitive to some extent. And it requires some knowledge to grasp with the idea of the structural balance. Moreover, it's very hard to use it as a forward-looking rule, because you do not know at which point of the cycle you currently are. And actually, when you have got the estimates of the potential product and whether you are above the potential product or below, you change all these estimates also in the past. So it's very hard to drive the fiscal policy on the rule, which is based on the constantly changing, not only the future, but constantly changing past. So we realized that we can't live even with this kind of rule, and even these rules were not very much followed, and we were unable to a large extent to comply with these rules. Quite fascinating was the finding of the European Fiscal Board. The European Fiscal Board was monitoring the compliance with the European fiscal rules, and they realized that we, on average, are in compliance with the EU fiscal rules in the EU only in 50% of all the occasions. So every second car on the crossroads is driving on the red light. Every second car. Try to imagine that you are going through the streets of this nice city, and every second car is driving on the red. And this is how we comply with the EU fiscal rules. This is an absolute disaster. Worse, and on top of that, is that much worse compliance is in the club of the Eurozone itself. It's much better compliance is outside of the Eurozone, despite these rules were meant as something like a glue keeping together the members of the monetary union. So it doesn't work perfectly, to say the least. So we started after the financial crisis, after the year 2010. You again might recall 2-packs, 6-packs, deep reforms without any special success and without any special, I would say, track record of better compliance. We started thinking about new rules or changed rules. There were extreme opinions. One extreme opinion was, let's not have any rules whatsoever, nothing. Leave it up to the national states and it is their decision. I would advise against this approach, and we were against this extreme approach, because it's very good to know what is the optimum, at least to know in theory, what is the optimum altitude for the flight, where is it safe for a plane to fly. Even if you do not comply, you at least know that you are outside of the safe boundaries. So it's good to know where it is safe to fly. But how to enforce it, it's much more complicated. So the opposite extreme view was, let's make very prescriptive, very detailed technical rules that would take into account what is happening in individual countries, in individual points in time, so that these rules are tailor-made for every country and every occasion and every moment. fine, good idea, but not a very practical one. Again, try to go out and try to imagine that we would have these strongly prescriptive and detailed rules about speed limits on the streets. So here the speed limit in the city is 50 kilometers. Okay, it's going to 30. Okay. Okay. Outside the city, it's 90 or 100. Okay, and then the highways. But these are relatively simple rules. Try to imagine that you would have very prescriptive rules saying that at Andrássy Utka you can drive 40. And if you go throughout the night, it's 45. And if it is the state holiday, it's 55. And et cetera, et cetera. You would not be able to live in the world with these technical, prescriptive, and detailed rules that take into account a specific situation, specific parts of the year and of the day. So we were advocates of simple rules. The rules have to be as simple as for the average policymaker to understand. Because without that, they will not comply. They do not comply anyway, but at least the probability of compliance is bigger if you can explain what the rules are and they understand what these rules are. But, and here I have to say I totally agree with what has been said by Gábor Daniel. Actually, in the EU, after the last reform, which is in effect since 2024, we went in the opposite direction. These are not simpler rules. These are more complicated rules in terms of the next expenditure rule, in terms of the new fiscal structural plans with different time spans, 4 to 7 years for individual countries. Well, these are not rules that are tough enough, and they are definitely not tougher. They are, in essence, they are weaker and harder to enforce. That's my strong opinion, and we can go to this in the debate. But what is the real challenge, and it was always a challenge in the EU, was, can you really have the rules that will serve as a substitute for a pure fiscal prudence on the level of individual countries and individual policymakers? Can the rules be a substitute for, for pure fiscal responsibility? And we have learned that they cannot serve this purpose. Typically, if you do not want to comply, you will always find a good reason why not to comply. If you want to break the rule, you'll always find a good way how not to comply. So these rules are not a substitute, but if they should serve as a principle for better fiscal management, again, they should be as simple as possible. And it will be very, very complicated, my last point, it will be very, very complicated in the EU to comply with any rules. Why is that? Again, Daniel has opened it up. We forgot that the world after the year 2019 has changed dramatically, and for Europe, totally. Because up until 2019, up until the COVID, what were the defining principles of our countries getting richer? Well, it was three of them. A, very cheap defense umbrella of the US. B, very cheap energy from Russia. And C, ever-expanding globalization, so ever-expanding division of labor, where the countries in Central and Eastern Europe played a very important role. We have been losing all these three at the same time ever since 2019. All these three. So suddenly, we are living in Europe where you have got so many very costly public priorities for the public finance. You have got defense, you have got energy, you have got incoming demography, you have got the necessity to deal with the with the fact that the economies are not running as fast as they used to. But we in the EU still have got the only identity priority on the EU level. And this is decarbonization. It was a very nice principle and very nicely financeable up until 2019. It will be much more complicated ever since 2019 and onwards, because we have got many other priorities, and we haven't learned on the national and pan-European level we haven't learned so far to prioritize. We want everything. And you know from the economic textbooks that you should always make the decision between producing butter or weapons. In Europe, we want butter and weapons at the same time, which means a big pressure on the public finance in all the countries. And in the countries where the public finance is more fragile and weaker, I think this impact will be stronger and more profound. So I do not want to say that it's not. Should I stop? They are colleagues. Should I stop? I know. I do not want to say that healthy public finances is not a good thing. Rather the opposite. But I do solemnly declare here that to keep the public finance in order in Europe will be much more complicated in the years to come than it was in the past. That's my last point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mojmír. Thank you very much. And in the meantime, I had the opportunity to look around in the room, and I realized that we have a very distinguished and professional audience. So I would propose that should we arrive to a point in our discussions when someone has an idea or some question or some addition, then feel free to raise hands and then be involved in our discussions. So coming back, thank you very much for your interventions. It was indeed very interesting. And let me start with a question of the ownership. So we now have these new EU rules which were aimed at simplifying the whole procedure, but at the end of the day, it seems that at the end of the day, it could be even more difficult and even more difficult to comply with. I do remember that from the official statistics of the Commission, it was clear that between 2011 and 2019, after 2019, they stopped doing such statistics. The ratio of the country-specific recommendations, which were considered fully implied by the Commission, moved between 10 and 15%, which is, I think, quite an interesting figure. So it means that most countries did not at all comply with the rules, because the rules seem to be really too complicated, and my takeaway from these figures and from my own practices that the Commission devoted much less time to know the single countries in more details than other international financial institutions, say the IMF or the OECD. So having said this, I really would like to know, how do you see how can the ownership work after these new regulations being implemented? So,
let me say something which by the way, the United States doesn't have a smaller problem. It's a fiddles. entity, clearly. It has a much easier time, I mean, when it comes to working out a fiscal policy, because it's a federal entity. I mean, we should not blame the EU for the wrong reason. The United States is running a budget deficit this year, which will go beyond 8% of GDP, and the public debt is larger than the aggregate public debt of the European Union. I shouldn't say a flaw. It's a fact of life. The Union is not a federal state. The euro area is not a federal entity. There are national fiscal policies. There is the euro. I mean, the euro area is functioning because there is a common monetary policy. There is no common fiscal policy. So the story of the Union is very complicated. And to think in terms of optimal rules, there are no optimal rules. It's, we've been trying to, not Dăianu, not the Romanian Fiscal Council, but the bureaucrats have been trying to figure out what would be more suitable under the circumstances. And it's inevitable for the rules to fail again, because the reality is more complex and complicated. When did we think, I mean, it's because Mojmír talked about the attempt to change the rules in the wake of the financial crisis. So it's not of recent vintage. It's not because of the pandemic. It's not because of the war. So what I would say, it's also an irony, is that when you are not a member of a union, you are at the mercy of financial markets, especially if the economy is small, is open and is small, like an emerging economy. It's not the case with the United States. Because of the dominant position of the United States, it has a reserve currency, it can run very large budget deficits. For how many years? I mean, it remains to be seen. But, and whenever there is a fracas, I mean, there are tremors in the Union, and there is a big shock, you see the ills ask for weaker economies in your jumping. Now, in France, because of the budget problem, I mean, it's the ills are moving upwards. So I don't expect fiscal rules to be optimal. I think what has to be, and again, Mojmír is right, I mean, there is a sense of fiscal prudence, fiscal responsibility, but when so many competing claims are on a budget which has limits, it's very, very hard. I mean, it's not economics, it's called the dismal science, and our times are much worse than they used to be, not a few years ago. So
maybe a practical example, because you are asking about the ownership, the sense of ownership. I do not know how about in Hungary, but we have got the first round of preparations of the new fiscal structural plan behind us in Czechia. So I can make some comparison. And so far, this document is the document of really secondary or even tertiary importance for the policymakers. The convergence report that we did up until the last year typically was also not a blockbuster, a political blockbuster, but the fiscal structural plan, it seems to me, for the policymakers like a totally technical stuff which we will not deal with. I know that there is a difference because the Czechia is not on the EDP. We are not within the excessive deficit procedure, and because of the fact that we are not in EDP and the debt is below 60, the requirements are not huge. But still, the first document that you produce set a track record for the future. So what is written now will be of some importance after 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. And the sense of ownership is, I would say, negligible, because the essence of all that is so technical and hard to deal with. That's why I was so skeptical. Maybe Daniel is not that much skeptical about this new set of rules. That's why I was so skeptical about the fact that this new framework will really bring a substantial change of policy or behavior. I don't believe that. Just my feeling.
With the ownership, usually the question is who should own this. And even in a review of the European Economic Governance Framework, this idea was emphasized that, for instance, the strengthening of the independent financial institutions should happen in order to reinforce national ownership over these fiscal prudence matters. However, I think, and it's an analogy to what I mentioned regarding spending, it's not necessary who owns this, whether it's the national government or the European Commission, which tries to gain a higher share in influencing what happens in the member states through these rules, but how we own these rules. I totally agree with the fact we never arrive at the optimal rules. Question is, if there is consensus that for the time being these are the rules we should adhere to, do we adhere to those rules? I refer here to a idea of economics, which nowadays we might less frequently refer to. These are institutions. This could be an institution for Europe if we could solidify that fiscal prudence is important, regardless of the currently prevailing rules, but we should adhere to it, because this is a yardstick of what we're doing. We're not yet there, definitely. And a reflection to the credibility of the fiscal structural plans. I tend to feel the same feeling as Mojmír mentioned. Maybe it's not of first-line importance for the governments engineering these plans. Maybe one of the reasons is that this is definitely a trial period. This is the first midterm fiscal structural plan the countries are doing. There are several unclarities around how to make it properly. And there are several unclarities. Do we really think that it's good to engineer a plan for 4 years or even 7 years and to say that, okay, this is the plan you have to stick in the coming 4 or 7 years? This is not the horizon anybody can foresee in the current world. So I think this adds to the skepticism and to the approach that, okay, we should do something, but we will see in a year what we really can do with such a medium-term plan.
There is a hell of a difference between countries which are running relatively reasonable public debts and no big budget deficits, and countries which have very large public debts and rising budget deficits. So, I mean, I understand that the new fiscal rules have to be tested, I agree, but the difference between these two sets of countries is very big. It's very big, and for good reasons, the Commission will be tougher with such countries, be it France or Italy, but they have to find a way. I mean, so I don't want to contemplate a situation where the budget deficit in France is running out of control. And so imagine what the euro area would look like. And I will repeat again, the euro area does not have basic constructs in its design. Okay? This is essential. ADIS does not exist. A joint fiscal capacity does not operate. A safe asset, and we always compare with the European markets with financial markets. There is no banking union, Germany banking union. Capital markets are fragmented in the EU. It's a reality. And par-dessus le marché, as the French would say, we are living in a period where the inward-looking syndrome is very, very intense. I mean, UniCredit attempted to take over Commerzbank, and you saw the response in Germany, so which indicates forget about a genuine banking union or unified markets. And so we should be pretty subdued in our expectation. Tough times are ahead.
Yep. Thank you. So, well, two of us here are under the EDP, so we have got reference paths from the EU, from the Commission to meet. And in case of Hungary, I see that we are quite far from that reference path. So how do you see that? How can we create the harmony between the Commission and ourselves? As I have the feeling, and this is what I try to emphasize, that it's quite difficult, the discussion between the Commission, the EU authorities, and the single countries. They hardly accept the local difficulties or the local specialties. So how can we bring those things together? Because if we cannot have an agreement, then if I understand well, then the Commission's path is valid, and this is what they will ask at the end of the day. They will look for at the end of the day.
I expect here further difficulties during the negotiations. Another factor in this, that now we are over the GDP growth data of the third quarter for Hungary, which triggered a revision from the European Union for the coming year's growth, which suggests to me that that there will be tough negotiations in this respect. So I expect quite a critical assessment on this medium-term national fiscal structural plan. I think it's of first-line importance to avoid a situation where the outcome is that there's a one-sided dictatum that we should go along the path which is prescribed by the European Union, because this going to have tremendous negative effects. This would trigger measures which really could ruin even those parts of public finances or economic health. I would not say growth, at least health, which are now more or less intact or show signs of improvement. And I would warn from a scenario where we, despite what is said by the Commission, try to follow some own agenda. So I think here in this respect, there should be a consensus, because if we maintain negotiations, it provides the room in order to correct some of the flows of this original suggested path from the European Commission, because it has also contained some not necessarily realistic assumption. For instance, forecasting the current level interest rates almost for eternity, which I think should be rethought. However, what we envisage in terms of growth for the coming years, this is a huge question. Even the Fiscal Council, when assessing next year's budget, in the first line mentioned the risk of growth for the coming year. We're calculating with 3.4%, which means basically the implicit assumption that the investment turnaround will come next year, and then the path of growth continues with this, assuming an above 3% growth over the coming years, which is contradicting the reference path of the European Union, definitely, because now they revised it below 2%, but even previously their forecast for the coming years was just slightly over 2%. So I expect a harsh assessment coming in December, or maybe beginning of January, because not all the countries, but quite many countries missed the original deadline and the extended deadline, and the European Commission will need some time to assess this, although the original plan was to finish it for early December. I don't know whether it's possible, and I don't know whether it's worth, in order to keep the deadline, say something instead of take the time. This is the first time to assess these medium-term plans, and maybe sacrifice the December deadline, but have the time for thorough and professional discussions going into next year.
And will the Fiscal Council be involved in the discussions with the commissions, or it will be the sole job for the ministry?
Not to my knowledge, and maybe this is right. So, just informally, we discussed that this should consider carefully what is the task of the Fiscal Council, making assessment, opinion, but not to be part of the policy making. Informal consultations we had with the Ministry of Finance when they received the reference path of the European Union. We had questions. It turned out that they also had questions. As I mentioned, this is the first time. Not all the details are clear. So according to what the colleague said from the Ministry of Finance, they had several questions toward the Commission, and even the answers were sometimes not as clear as one would expect in order to make an unambiguous plan. Yeah. So only informal involvement.
Daniel, for 7 years, it's even more difficult.
Okay, let me again emphasize the debate we had inside the network of IFIs, and also in a piece which I wrote and I published where I questioned the wisdom which was emanating, the wisdom from the Commission, to involve directly or indirectly the IFIs in policymaking. I said that would be very wrong. That would be very wrong. We would not be able to qualify as independent watchdogs, advocates as fiscal prudence. The moment you get into the policymaking, then presumably you should set up another entity. We should be independently making assessments. So that was my point of view, and I was glad that the Council, when it's diverged from the position of the Commission. Now, about the specific Romanian case, 7 years because the budget deficit is very large. It's the largest budget deficit. To think that you can bring it down when growth rates, GDP growth rates are going down. I mean, it's in Europe, and the state of the European Union, the European economy is so bad. To think that you can achieve such a huge adjustment in a few years' time, it's ridiculous. You would provoke a depression in the economy. So 7 years seems to be reasonable, but I don't know about the patience of markets. We could experience sudden stops in financial markets. So, and this is why being a EU member state, it's a big plus. We have also the EU funds, and I understand why. I mean, it's when Hungary was denied some of the funds, I understand why there was pressure on the foreign. EU funds are very, very important. I mean, even for the current account deficit funding, they also make a contribution. We do not have reserve currencies. So we are being pushed by financial markets unless we are prudent. Non-Euro area member states, I shouldn't say the advantage, but we get signals from financial markets. If we make big mistakes, we are going to be punished. It's true that we have the benefit of EU membership, and there is no case of a European Union member state which defaulted. There is no such, although technically you could argue that, I mean, it's some of the Euro area member states defaulted technically in 2008, 2009, and so on. So, and as Gábor said, we are very much at the beginning. Can we think about growth rates? I mean, it's staying. Forecasts are very vulnerable forecasts. So we have to adapt. The Commission will have to revise, as central banks always do, revise the numbers. National statistics are also revised from time to time. So we should be, say, balanced in our judgment. We cannot plan the future. We cannot do it.
I always feel pain when we talk about the EU funds. So you may have had something. If you are the lucky guy with no EDP.
I will go to this point, but firstly, yes, we are also a watchdog which can only bark. We do not bite. That's why I believe, and I agree with Daniel, the barking must be credible. Yeah. So you should not bark at anyone simply because you can. It must be in the right moment, because otherwise not a credible barking means that you as a watchdog do not work. So that's why the Commission typically each and every year consults us. They come to us. They attend us and do want to hear our view about the fiscal stance, what is going to happen. So I assume they take this into account. It's point number one. Point number two, I would not, well, I still think that there is no room for complacency, just saying you are not in the EDP, so sigh of relief and forget about everything. you know that in the fiscal policy is not an American movie. In American movies, good guys are always good guys, bad guys are always bad guys. In fiscal policy, good guys can turn bad guys and vice versa. It might change, and it happens. So it's always better to be prepared, and that's why I believe it is important to respect the framework and to have some prudence, even in the times when you technically are below certain below certain levels, and you might say that you do not care. I think you should care always. And the third thing is, I think that we should start a debate not only about fiscal issues on the national level, on the level of individual states of the EU. There is a new universe also on the pan-European level. I'll give you two examples. Next Gen EU, RRF.
You're not a pain for us.
Well, but the fact is that this is the pan-European debt, which is not ascribed to individual member states. So we technically, and in fact, we do not know who really owes this money. Mm-hmm. And this is a debt which does not appear in the national accounts of individual EU countries. It's not there. So it's a perfect kind of a debt, because it's a debt of no one. No one's debt, but really it is. And Eurostat has not solved this issue so far. On top of that, it's very interesting to realize that the European Commission, you know that the EU has to have a balanced budget according to the primary legislation of the EU. So it has to have a balanced budget. So how do we get to this debt without having a deficit in the first place? It can't happen on the level of individual member states. It can happen, and it happened, on the pan-European level. So somehow the Newtonian physics does not apply here. And example number two, we have realized relatively recently, we had a visit from the Single Resolution Board. You know, this is the institution Single Resolution Fund within the banking union, where you collect the money from banks for orderly recapitalization. Single Resolution Fund has got something like 80 billion euro of this collected money, and they haven't paid a single euro so far. The Single Resolution Fund was not used so far. I do not know whether the National Resolution Fund was used in Hungary. I do not know. It was never used in the case of Czechia, but we've got one. And funny thing is that if you actually use these funds on the national level, then drawing from these funds does have a direct impact on the public finance, because these institutions typically are government institutions or are a part of the larger government. So, for instance, when we repaid the covered deposits after the Sberbank collapse, this is the Standard Deposit Insurance Fund. This directly influenced the public expenditure, because the Deposit Insurance Fund is a part of the general government. The Resolution Fund is also a part of the general government. So drawing from this means that you're directly increasing the expenditure of the public sector, while this rule does not apply in the banking union. In banking union, when you draw from the Single Resolution Fund, it's outside of the public finance of individual countries. It's beyond the realm of the fiscal policy of individual countries, because there are no national compartments in the Single Resolution Fund. So again, you cannot ascribe the money to anyone. And there is a clear discrepancy in how these money are being treated in terms of the public finance in the banking union, outside of the banking union. So I just want to say that we should deal not only with the level of individual states, but also with the pan-European level, because there are some clear inconsistencies and we haven't sorted out them yet. And this is something that we also started, and we are opening this up.
Daniel, you want to make a comment?
So, this is a hidden liability, clearly. I mean, at one point in time, if financial markets, global financial markets, are going to lose trust, I mean, it's like financial markets losing trust. I mean, it's in the U.S. government, because of running such a large public debt and having such a large power and a very large budget deficits, however powerful an economy is, it's not God-given, its strength. So, and you could argue at one point I may have to raise the budget deficit, the budget, the union's budget. Some people may say there is no need for such a budget, but some people remember the McDougall report. I mean, decades ago, who said, I mean, the EU budget should be 4 or 5% of the union GDP for the union to survive. I mean, to have an easy ride. So, or I mean, think about the ECB buying government bonds. It did it. QE. I mean, I'm not saying that the ECB should buy. I mean, it's the union's debt. I mean, but you never know. You never know. So where I concur with what Mojmír says, I mean, we should be fiscally very responsible, but it's like our economies and our societies on two trajectories. We want to spend more and more. We have to spend for some priorities more and more, and we have a limited amount of resources. I mean, this is, and God cannot send an audit on earth. I mean, it's who can do it. I mean, it's then there is populism at the same time. There's people's frustration. This is why I may sound very pessimistic, but
I'm also quite pessimistic in this regard. I agree entirely with Daniel that the only enforcement, the only credible enforcement comes from the markets at the end of the day. Not everyone is afraid of the punishment from the Commission, so to speak. So the credible punishment comes from the markets, but that's why we've got the rules. The rules should make sure that you never crash the plane, that you never get to this dangerous territory. And that's why I believe even in these tough times, when we have got so many priorities and we are unable to prioritize, actually, I always thought that this is the very essence of politics, that you should prioritize and this is the very basics of why we have got elected politicians, so to prioritize. Huh? But if you can't prioritize, then I would say the role of our watchdogs for quite some time may be even bigger, because we might see the mountains maybe sooner than others, and maybe it is up to us to say, Jesus Christ, now it's really a dangerous territory. Maybe this is one of the roles that we should play. That's why I'm skeptical, and it means that I also don't believe, like Daniel, that we should make specific policy proposals. We can say what is the best practice at best, but we should be ready to fight for some elementary fiscal responsibility, even in the environment when everything is against us. Mm-hmm. So I think it is one of our rules.
Well, let's move a little bit further down. If I may use your expression, so how can you prepare for yourselves for proper barking? So according to the new rules, the Fiscal Council should be reinforced in terms of staffing, in terms of budget, in terms of whatever, to be much more strong and much more influential. So how are you in this respect, or how do you think, how do you see the time frame when you can build up yourselves?
We're quite at the beginning of the road. The new framework envisages several years for this, and the formulation is quite light because it said that for various functions, the independent fiscal institutions should start their enhanced contribution from some of them 2031, some of them a little bit earlier, if they have been staffed accordingly. It says this. The Hungarian Fiscal Council has its clear-cut tasks formulated in the Hungarian fundamental law and the stability law on the economy, which is a narrow path. The direct staff is accordingly. However, we have the National Bank of Hungary and the State Audit Office to support the Council enforced by the law. However, this is now focused on the very defined tasks of the Council, and far from what is envisaged in the new framework. For instance, to provide the Council's own economic forecasts for growth and for the major macroeconomic variables. We haven't started yet to consult with the government, basically, how they interpret these rules. It's a question how the Commission will interpret the fulfillment of these rules. We definitely have the time. I myself believe in organic development. So the first steps can be that that some of these tasks are started by the Council according to a certain schedule. Meanwhile, we can discuss the legal part of it. I'm myself not a legal expert. I learned that I should rely on them when I'm interpreting laws. However, on the economic side, currently the Fiscal Council does not have its own economic forecast. We rely on the contributions of the research labs of Hungary, with which we are cooperating with, and the National Bank of Hungary and the State Audit Office.
Others?
Yes, similarly, we do not produce our own forecasts. We should work to this end. It would be great, but we need a larger staff. We need, I'll be very candid with you, we need better pay, I mean, to attract top-notch professionals. We also rely to a certain extent on the central bank's expertise. But in general, apart from a few IFIs in the Union, very few, as a matter of fact, most of the IFIs, independent IFIs, do not produce forecasts. They deliver assessments, whether of budget drafts, whether of spending reviews, which is also a novelty. In the Netherlands, for example, the bigger IFI, which is like a big think tank, makes assessments of economic policies propounded by various political parties. It's a very large, it's like a think tank. It's, the country can rely on an economic policy which comes out of what this think tank believes. And the Spanish IFI is very, very strong in terms of the people it has, the experts. I mean, the Italian IFI is also, but they are very hard to replicate in most of the other EU member states. This is where we are. The Commission would love to see the IFIs much more powerful, and we accept it. It's a working assumption that the trust we enjoy. Mojmír mentioned this, it's not a magical word. We should do what we can. If you try to do what you cannot do, the trust you enjoy, whether you enjoy it, collapses. So we should try to do what we can deliver. This is very important. And the trickiest issue would be to get into policymaking. That we should not transgress. This is like a red line. We should not go around it.
A couple of comments. We also do not produce our own forecast. And I have to say that I'm pleased that we do not produce our own forecast. We have got the joint methodology agreed with the finance ministry on some critical points, like defining the steady state and some critical elements of it. But I think that we should not go down this road, producing our own forecast, and to compete with the finance ministry or the central bank on this soil. We should serve more as an auditor rather than a chief financial officer who is producing his or her own final statement. We should be the auditor saying, is it in order or not? But there will be a nice example which you might follow and then compare after some time. This is our Slovak colleagues. Our Slovak colleagues created a full-fledged DSG model after, I think, 3 years of work. And they put a real-time granular data from all the state institutions, be it the finance ministry, the Ministry of Labor, etc., etc. And they are capable of producing almost online estimates of the impact of fiscal policy on individual groups of the society, be it pensioners, families with kids, without kids, etc. So we have seen that. It's called Tatrask. We have seen that relatively recently, and it is a huge piece of work. Again, I would not go down this road. I don't think that this is our task. But maybe after 2, 3, 4 years, we may gather again and to say what are the experiences of our Slovak colleagues compared to the rest of Central Europe. Maybe we will see something that we can't see right now. Resources and the size and let's say the stuffing of the IFI. In our case, it's 13 full-time equivalent persons, so it's relatively small. But you understand, guys, this is very tricky, because on the one hand, you should have a proper staffing. On the other, we are the ones telling the other institutions you should not expand indefinitely. We are the ones telling them you should not turn into classical Niskanen's bureaucracies that are defined by the amount of the budget and number of staff. So we should lead also by example. So we are trying to do as much as possible with the limited resources. Whether it works or not, you have to ask someone else. I just can say that so far it seems to me that the political elite cannot agree what we say. We became a point which is not ignorable in terms of fiscal policy and what is happening on the side of the fiscal policy. So far, so good. And an anecdotal evidence is from our country that typically our statements are being quoted more by the politicians in opposition than in the current government. But a good thing is that when they change sides, those who didn't like our statements suddenly start liking them, and vice versa. So it's symmetric in this sense, and it seems to me that it gives you some credibility, because the very same people at some point say, we do not agree with you, and then say, okay, we completely agree with you. So the audience can identify that they have changed their mind. We haven't changed our mind. So far, so good. But again, nothing, and this was my last sentence in the first intervention, nothing can be a perfect substitute of willingness of the political elite and the electorate to have some reasonable fiscal stability. If this is not there, even the watchdog, even the barking can't get it out of it.
Because you start with, your second question was about policy ownership. Why? Why this concept has emerged as so prominently? Is because Brussels felt that is always vilified by national governments when something goes wrong. There was need also, a real need to have governments which are more conscious about what needs to be done, and hence the temptation to involve IFIs in national policy making directly or indirectly. But the big threat for the IFIs is that they could easily be identified as the voice of Brussels. And this is very threatening, because on one hand, we should be very honest intellectually. We should speak the truth to the extent we can speak the truth, and we should speak the truth. We also make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. But we should also be very cautious, because we should gain our trust in the dialogue we have with all the stakeholders in our society and in the dialogue with Brussels. We may also be at loggerheads with Brussels. Nobody, it's predicates that national IFI should see eye to eye with Brussels all the time. But we should be very careful so that we should not be seen as the voice of Brussels, imposing the will of Brussels. We should try to see profiles ourselves as trying to help our economies, our governments to perform better, to have fiscal responsibility imbued in the practices of the government and so on and so on. It's not easy at all. Not easy at all, because in the Union we have a democratic deficit. And we should not make a contribution to this increase the democratic deficit. So, but it depends also on the people who speak, on the people, the quality of the people one has. And it's national IFIs are national They're not independent European national IFIs. Of course, we have the European dimension, but we are national IFIs. And Mojmír also mentioned that we should think about the EU issues. Very much true, Mojmír, and you remember, I have always said it, but this is a very sensitive issue. I mean, it's in the network, people are refrain from talking about what they believe that is the politicians preserve. We should not deal with issues which confront the frugal states with the big spenders in the union. I mean, it's in my view, national IFIs should be much bolder in this regard and speak up in a diplomatic way, but and also I agree that it's not easy, because if one could argue, yes, and I see sometimes national IFIs positions being very close to government's positions, which again, intellectually, is not acceptable. An independent fiscal council is not by practicing independence vis-a-vis a government, so that the probability of failures, of mistakes, should be minimized, but it should be independent intellectually. I mean, it should not refrain from thinking about the big issues. But this is the constellation of political constellation of the union, and we are all human beings, and there are animosities, there are also conflicts, there are egos, big countries versus small countries, the frugal countries, the big spenders. But in the end, we have to save the union. If we believe that being a member of the union brings pluses. Because I may sound, again, very pessimistic, but think about a counterfactual, not having the union. To see a Europe again with member states fighting each other. Member states sometimes are fighting each other inside the union. Imagine not having the union. I mean, so this is why we should be more honest, and all of us should be more honest. Yes.
I have some more questions, but if there are questions from the audience, then they would welcome us. We are approaching to the lunch break, but so let me give the option. Yes, please. Please wait for the mic. Here.
Chat Magdolna. May I have a naive or maybe crazy question? Balancing the budget is extremely important for several reasons. But as we know, the largest spender is the government. And would it be possible for the Finance Council to require governments to attach efficiency calculations in every case when the government spends money on government investments? The reason I'm asking this because, as you may remember, Gábor's slides, one of them showed a very important number. As a proportion of state budget, Hungary spends the most on economic affairs. But if we see the performance of the economy, it's not doing very well. The question, would it be possible to require government financial planners to do efficiency calculations, return on investment calculations to improve the budget. Thank you.
I like the idea very much, and that's why I mentioned it in my presentation, and I raised the issue previously as well. That yeah, I think maybe the most important question is how we spend the money. IFIs, as they are national institutions, as Daniel said, may have a louder voice on the national level. However, I do think that this field has to be tackled on a European level as well, not just because of the Draghi report that it suggests that we should spend even more, but because of the experience of past spending. What is the most important criterion to spend the EU transfers? It's the deadline. If you spend it before the deadline, it's okay, but over the deadline you lose it, which means that sometimes there's no time, no energy invested in order to assess properly the investment proposals, because politically it's just unbearable to lose funds because we missed the deadline. So it's better to spend the money on less efficient investment. So I think this is one point which should be tackled prior to moving the focus of public investment spending from the nation states to the EU level, because simply just because we increase the amount to be spent on investment, we define some target areas or focus areas, it will not automatically improve the quality of our spending. So I'm quite sympathizing with the idea. Sure.
This is a brilliant question, really brilliant question. I would say, give me a perfect methodology and we will do a perfect job. But you might, you very well know that we have got so many quarrels within our community, even about the fiscal multipliers, for instance, their strength, how do they work? So we are far from a point where we could say we have got perfect measures of efficiency, but we will closely watch Gábor and his work. Maybe this will be something to follow. But there are fiscal councils doing different things, like ex-ante costing, calculating the ex-ante costs of planned policies, be it of the government or the opposition, which is very useful, it seems to me, quite nice. There are countries that do zero budgeting, where you have to really define from scratch every year, and you have to defend your expenditures from scratch every year. This is fine. Where we end up in our country is with the simple sentence, there is always a budget constraint. Guys, there is a budget constraint. So there is not an unlimited amount of funds. And you would be surprised. Once you have got a budget constraint and you enforce the budget constraint on the national level, many things are more efficient than without any budget constraint, suddenly. You know it. You know it from I don't know, from your families everywhere. The budget constraint in itself is some force, but here I think it's an ideal, but you are already working on that.
No.
Yes, IFIs, not all of them, but all of us, we are asked to perform spending reviews. But very few of the IFIs have the expertise and do perform spending reviews. Spending reviews basically refer to the whole range of expenditure. You should do it about healthcare, about education, about investment, public goods. But you said something. The government is the biggest spender. My dear lady, the government or the public sector is supposed to provide public goods. It's not a spender for the sake of spending. It provides public goods which crowd in private goods. And when there is a big crisis, the private sector comes to be claimers to be rescued by the government. You're right, we have to have efficient spending because many people make fortunes by working in lucrative businesses and connecting with the public sector and so on and so on. It's a big issue, but not all over the world. So there should be spending reviews. We should be very careful about investment. I mean, there are some people who say the Draghi report asks for, on an annual basis, more than 5% of the aggregate GDP. Some people say, no, the money is available. I have a friend, Sonny Kapoor, who says, no, Daniel, I mean, this money is available. If you create the capital markets union, if you have the banking union, if you create a proper environment which provides the incentives for the private sector to invest, it's easy to say. What we see from the numbers, if you compare investment in the union before the financial crisis, the level, what, 22, 23% on aggregate term, with the current investment level, yeah, it's about 16, 17%. It's exactly what the Draghi report says. We should get back to 20% to him. Then Monti said, Mario Monti, the former Italian prime minister, said we should judge investment different from current spending. I mean, we should be, because investment, yes, but if you spend more, you say, we invest. What are you investing? What do you invest in? The union has for years, not for decades, had the Lisbon agenda, Europe 2020, and talked about a more digital economy, more R&D, and so on and so on. And it appears that Americans have a much better environment in this regard. In this regard, not in all respects. This is why they have the Silicon Valley and the very large companies. Whereas in Europe, because of competition law and other reasons, we do not have very large companies. We should compete with American companies and Chinese companies. The Draghi report also says it. But can you imagine in the union, especially in the big countries, politicians accepting no more barriers, we should have pan-EU, very large companies which should compete with American and the Chinese companies. No, national identities are still very powerful, national interests are very powerful. We talk about the common defense capacity, which does make sense if we look what's happening in the world. But defense capacities are still very much national, not European, the European Union. But this is the current state of affairs. It may change in the years to come.
Thank you so much. Oh.
Sorry, I can't miss the opportunity. Daniel raised the question, what we can regard as investment. This is a very good question, because, for instance, money spent on education is current spending in the budget. But what is more an investment than money spent on the education? Just a few months ago, we've been talking about this topic right here, how to spend money wisely on education. And I cite here from the Fiscal Council's 3-year outlook, which was published at the very beginning of this year. Just one sentence. The most important economic factors of the previous decade can only be moderately increased in quantity, so their quality must be improved in order to continue convergence. So, for instance, money spent on education should be qualified as investment.
Yes. This is fascinating. We've got this debate everywhere. In our case, I do not know how about Romania and Hungary, investment became a very popular term politically. Investment is a good thing. Spending is a bad thing. Spending means, just spending on something that is not useful. Investing is very important, and you should do more investment. This, in sense, in our political debate, appeared something like an abuse of the word investment, and the abuse goes that far that in the many politicians say we should invest into our pensioners, meaning we should increase pensions. We should invest into our state employees, meaning hire more and pay them more. Like if you abuse the word investment, then you can translate it into virtually any spending whatsoever, and you can say this is just the investment. So I agree, but we have to be very careful about the defining line.
Well, we are just running out of time, but maybe one more question, if you have. If not, I have one more last question to Mojmír. That I remember that there was a time when you were quite supportive to the helicopter money. How do you see that from your present position?
But always monetary money, not the fiscal money. So
even though it has a secondary effect on the fiscal.
Well, very secondary. Some are positive. To make long story short, I still believe that there might be times like strong deflationary pressures when the monetary policy might use, when hitting zero lower bound, even non-conventional policy like this. And I think at some points it might be justified. I think that it should be in the arsenal of monetary policy still. But hopefully we will not return to zero lower bound any soon. I don't expect that.
Well, then thank you very much. Thank you very much for your coming here and for your very valuable interventions and interesting interventions. I think that this is going to be a very good practice. So we can organize our future conferences this way, if Gábor agrees and supports the idea. And next year we will have more experience with the new regulations, and we can have more on that. So thank you for the panelists. Thank you for the audience for your attention and the questions. And let's have a quick lunch outside. We have a buffet lunch, and I would suggest to continue our conference at 1 p.m. and the second part will be chaired by Gábor. So thank you again, and please join me thanking the panelists.